So, welcome everybody. Most of you know me, some of you know me. My name's Nicola Hillary and I'm the funding manager at Transition Network. And I'm one of the co-guardians of the Municipalities in Transition Communities of Practice. And this is the second of our webinars that we're calling the Hot Topics discussion. And this one's all about funding. This one is about how to resource our work, the work of collaboration between communities and municipalities, and particularly need for funding for processes. So I'm going to facilitate, and Juan, here, is my co-host, particularly helping on the technical side of things. And we have some great co-presenters with us today, Nicolas Krausz, Ellie Besley-Gould and Peter Lippman. So before we start, just as a check-in, Juan is going to post you 4 questions in the chat window, and hopefully you can find the chat window. On the bottom row you should be able to see a button called chat, which opens up the chat window on the side. And we'll be inviting you to answer these questions in the chat window.
Are the questions?
Here are the questions.
Maybe I can read it quickly like this. Where are you? I mean, the place. Where are you right now? Who are you? If you can in one sentence say something about you. What brought you here? Also one sentence or one word. And if you agree that this recording, the recording of this webinar will be used publicly online. This is something very important for us, though. Because there's many people that has asked for the recording, and we know that unfortunately they couldn't join us in this time.
So if you can share your answers to those 4 questions in the chat now, that would be great. Obviously the question about recording, that's due to the GDPR data regulations, and of course if you want to withdraw your consent at any time, just get in touch or tell us now. I can't see anything in my chat window. Why is that? Nenad's in Croatia and his living room. So hopefully, if you're having any trouble with the chat, let Juan know. Welcome Hannah from Brussels. And welcome Franz from Austria. Obviously Tracy from Budapest in Hungary.
Eleanor, question was what, not who.
I read who. Okay, I'll put what on there.
Cool.
So obviously this is your chance to read through the chat and see who else is in this conversation today. I realise I haven't put myself on. We just have to guess.
Go, Nicola.
So just before we get started, I wondered if it was useful for Juan to give us a very short introduction, just to clear the mysteries. What is this Municipalities in Transition project anyway? If you can tell us in a couple of minutes, that would be really great.
Okay, Nicola. Well, as I can see, already many of you know about the project. So maybe I will repeat some of the things you know. But I'm gonna explain you in 2 minutes a few aspects of it. Well, the Municipalities in Transition project was born more or less 2 years ago. We could define it as an action research project And it was born together through the collaboration of different transition hubs in different countries and transition network. The main idea of the project is foster collaboration between civil society and municipalities to work on systemic change at municipal scale. So how can we together at the municipal scale foster systemic change? Because we have identified that the municipal scale is a key leverage point. It's a scale where we can have a strong impact, and at the same time we can know the stakeholders and we can work much better because it's much more.
Tem a apresentação, né?
Okay. I'm just putting in silence. Somebody was that. And well, right now the project is testing a framework, a methodology in 6 different pilots in 5 countries. 2 in Italy, 1 in Spain, 1 in Portugal, 1 in Brazil, and 1 in Hungary. And what we're doing there is working collaboratively with people from the municipalities and people from civil society. And we're testing a methodology to identify the leverage points to work there. And they are right now in the action phase. So they are designing and implementing different actions. This part of the project, it will end more or less in March. And the idea is to harvest all the information from these experiments. And after that, being able to have, let's say, the Municipalities in Transition 1.0 framework and being able to test it in other places and work with that. It's based also in many of the transition principles, like subsidiarity or like resilience and others. And just to end with this quick summary, another leg of this project is the community of practice, another part of this whole framework, because what we're doing is experimenting, we're practicing, and since the beginning, one of the things we had very clear is that we need to have a space for sharing these experiments, for learning from many different cases that are happening around the world. And this is basically what we're doing. We are right now having working with the pilots in this community of practice, and at the same time we have this wider community of practice where we're exploring different key topics, and this is this webinar is part of this hot topics discussion that the topics were chosen by the members of this community, and I think this is kind of a summary. I don't know, Nicola, because you are also part of the project, if you want to complement it. But I think it's a summary. And by the way, there's a huge interest in this topic about how to foster systemic change at municipal scale. And there's many different projects apart from this one trying to work more or less in this subject. And we have identified a lot of interest and connections. And this is just the beginning. So let's see how we all together make this evolve and continue. And thank you, by the way, to all the presenters for coming. Ellie, Peter, and Nicola.
Thank you, Juan. That's great. So I'm just going to give a little brief introduction to the subject matter. Then you'll hear from our co-presenters, and after that, the floor will be wide open and we'll be hearing from everybody. But in terms of just framing the subject of why we're here today, in the Municipalities in Transition project, and I think we are not alone in this, we have the challenge of securing funding resources when you don't have predictable outcomes, because your outcomes are grassroots led. And, you know, we're very much working with a process, or in fact a complex set of processes, all about participatory decision making, co-design, consultation, building trust, the emergence of what would be the right way forward for the project, all of which makes it very difficult at the start of the project to say exactly what the outcomes and impacts will be. And this is a challenge. for fundraising. We've certainly been given feedback from funders that we weren't clear about our outcomes. And beyond this, it can be very common for funders to have relatively narrow criteria, which can make it difficult to promise that it's definitely going to go in the direction that the funder is particularly interested in. I have to say, the Municipalities and Transition projects, we were very involved in this year's European Day of Sustainable Communities event in Brussels. And there was a funding breakout group there where this was one of the key messages, that actually, when it's grassroots led, it adds an extra layer of complication to finding the funds for it. And funding, as we know, in general is a challenge because the funders who are there are very oversubscribed. There's often the challenge of fundraising being very short term. You get money for 1 or 2 years, perhaps. Even 3 years can go past in a flash. And when we're talking about transition and many of the other different labels in this area of work, this is very broad. We range from social justice, economic effects. It's very broad. It's often much broader than a particular funder may be analysing. I suppose I'm just going to end by saying actually the value of a project often comes from the people power. It often comes from the processes of engagement or co-design or trust building or decision making that's going on, and it can be very hard to quantify and demonstrate that. And back at that European Day of Sustainable Communities event, there was a beautiful analogy that one of the speakers, Erica, in fact, from one of the pilots of this project gave. She said that some types of bamboo, they can grow for 7 to 8 years in the soil before you ever see a shoot appear. And she was likening this to all the groundwork that you have to put in terms of people processes at the community level of scale before you see flowering of a project with tangible impacts that you can kind of show off to the world. And that rang very true, and I think it's part of our challenge. So that was my brief introduction to our challenges. And before we carry on, I just wanted to introduce one of our co-presenters today, Peter Lippman, who wants to just introduce himself briefly. Say who you are, Peter.
Hi, everyone. I'm not going to say very much because actually, although I am now part-time working for Full Circle Foundation, which is the anonymous foundation that supports Transition Network, I've got much more experience on the other side of the fence, kind of asking foundations for money and feeling baffled as to why my completely brilliant pitches and ideas have completely failed. So I can certainly tell you about how to handle the sorrow that results from that sensation. But I just also wanted to say thank you to Ellie and Nicola, who it's just really great of them to step in and help us today.
Yes, and welcome to some of the people who have joined us in the last few minutes. Great to see you and hear from you in the chat. And I'm going to hand over to Nicola Krausz, who is from the Charles Mayer Foundation, FPH as they're known. This is our privilege to have an actual funder on the call today, and none of you are allowed to pitch to him, that's part of the deal. But he's able to tell us about what this challenge looks like from the funder's point of view, which I think is really valuable, and especially as from a funder who's really interested in the whole area of municipalism. So over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, everybody, and hello. It's a real pleasure and honor as well to be invited to this webinar. Some of you know already that I'm a huge fan of transition networks and transition towns. I've been amazed by the story of this movement, which was one of the most interesting things that happened during the last years in terms of, bringing the transition, bringing the need for another system and other practices down to the places and all over the world. So it's an amazing success, and I also express my gratitude to Peter Lippman, who is one of my mentors, not only when it comes to resilience and changing, your life, but also now in philanthropy, because he has his double life, as he just said. I have 3 points, but I will shorten the first one. The first one was about why it is so important to work at the city level and also with municipalities. The second one is why it is so hard to do so in a meaningful way for most of the funders around the place. And my third point is what can we try to do despite these difficulties and pitfalls. So yeah, kind of introduction, but you all know the story. In our opinion, in my foundation, but it's also shared with a lot of funders and movements. The nation state has become a problem. Some times ago, it was maybe the solution when it was still possible to build a kind of global governance system. But now we see everywhere, in different places, in different countries in the world, that the state has become a threat for most of our friends, for progressive ideals, and of course, progressive policies. The list is quite long, so I won't go through it, but you all know what I'm talking about. What can be done in face of this trend? Of course, we think that the cities can become solutions. And it's not only because we have to find an alternative to the state, but it's also because in cities, and we have good examples, there was the movements, the grassroots movement, grounded movements, have become very powerful, and in some cases have won the power. So that's the nice story of what happened in Spain a few years ago, and that's very inspiring. And I guess it was also one of the only light in the dark in terms where we were thinking of solutions and alternatives to the nationalism, xenophobia, etc. So the whole topic is how can we, as foundations, how can we accompany these movements? And they are numerous, they are very diverse. I have a huge list here of, brands, flags, names. So the right to the city, right to housing movements, the transformative cities, the commons and the commoners who work at the city level to change the economic system. Of course, Occupy movements, Indignados in Spain, Nuit debout in France, and many others. So during these last years, I think since after the financial crisis in 2008, all these movements are, just popped up, and some of them disappeared, but they sowed some seeds, and now we know how they grew up. I love the bamboo metaphor that Nicola was using earlier. And now we have, so one of the role of the foundation is to seed the new. That's how myself and my foundation are considering our role. But that's the second point. It's very hard to do it. It's very hard to understand and to identify the role that we can play in this momentum. I think I've listed 3 reasons why it's so difficult, and it's about fears. So the first one is the fear of the just in my background syndrome. It's not, it's not the other one. It's just in my background. So if a foundation considers that a solution can only work in a specific place, then they might feel a little bit disappointed because they always want to scale up. So if it only works there, why should I put my money? Because I need to fix all the problems everywhere. So that's, I think that's the first issue that we have to keep in mind. The second one is the fear of becoming too political. The closest you move towards municipalities or towards, as a funder, movements or partners working with municipalities, the most likely you will be seen as playing political games as a foundation. And we don't want, and we are not allowed to play those games, most of us, especially in Europe. So that can become a problem if you are considered as working with political parties or backing up the movement that will run for the elections. So that's something very important also to take into account. The third fear is the fear of diversity. As I just mentioned very briefly, there are many movements in the cities of change, as we call them. Many movements, working on very diverse issues. Some of them, they have just one single issue they want to address. And it's very hard when you have this systemic change approach to deal with that, because if you work with the housing movement, they will ignore the question of the, I don't know, relocalization of the economy, or they might ignore the ecological issues at stake in the cities, etc., etc. So this problem of silos in which some movements are stuck is also problematic, and in some cases it's that this problem ends up in foundation working just with one brand, or even some of them can create their own brands instead of working with the current actors in the places. So I think that these three fears, there might be others, of course, will determine how foundations will be framing their cities-based or cities-oriented programs, and that's something to have in mind. But it doesn't mean that nothing happens, but that the foundations might be very difficult animals to deal with when it comes to the kind of processes and goals you have in mind. And Juan reminded us about your systemic change ambition. So the third point, what can we do in this context, and despite these fears and these blockages? I will take two. So on the foundation side, what we are trying to do. So I will start with my own foundation. We have set up this municipalist program, which is a way for us to equip and to help the movements on two things. The first one is to engage with citizens and start a process of organizing citizens. Not only for they could run for elections, but that's not our point here. We wish that the citizens understand they can take the power back. They can feel they have a control on the political, on their territories, on their cities. And the second aspect of this program is also to elaborate with experts, but also with movements, grassroots, what kind of new policies, progressive policies, could be implemented at the local level by the municipalities. Not only because they might win the city hall, but also because they might advocate for these propositions to the I'm late to the existing political parties. So that's a new program, and we have some grantees in Spain and in France. The second initiative that we have taken is within EDGE. So EDGE is a network of progressive foundations, and we have just launched the Cities of Change Funders Collaborative with 5 other foundations, some in Europe, one in the US, and one in Latin America. And the idea is to also try to create this network of foundations interested in changing the political situation from the cities. But it doesn't mean only the big cities. It can also be, you know, towns and even villages. But to use the political opportunity that is left at this level for citizens to step up and take over their destiny, take back their destiny. And the third one is we try to advocate within another funders group, which is hosted by the European Foundation Center, which is called Funders Forum for Sustainable Cities, which gathers more mainstream foundations. And we try to push this agenda, municipalism, transition, housing, right to the city, commons in their discussions, which is not an easy thing to do, but we'll need some time, but we're gonna try. I will end up, sorry, I'm a little bit late. I've tried to write 3 or 4 recommendations for you as in your fundraising, in your, seeking the fund that you need for the good stuff that needs to happen in your network. The first one is you maybe clarify the relationships you intend to have with both the politicians, the current ones, but also with the electoral processes or agenda that's going to happen in your country. I think it's important because then you can avoid any kind of misinterpretation or misunderstanding between what you want to do and what the funders imagine that you want to do. You see what I mean? In terms of, stepping up and becoming too political in this sense. The second is, and you already do it, I know, you should emphasize the networked dimensions of your initiatives. It's very important that it's not understood, it's not seen as, fragmented or, single initiatives, but as a whole, as a network, which is, is strengthening the finding, the outcomes, the experiments at a broader level than just the territory where it's taking place. The third one reflects on the prototype dimension of your initiatives, but it has been said, so it's wonderful. Because if you do so, then it can be also relevant for the foundations supporting advocacy, political advocacy or sectorial advocacy. And I think that even in my foundation, the next step is really to understand the usefulness, the relevance of funding prototypes. It's very complicated. It's a long work and hard work, but I think that when we believe in changing the system from the ground and in places, we need to use this kind of tools and funding. And the last one, the last one is you should talk to your funders and the ones the other foundations about the initiative that EDGE has just started, and you will help us a lot and bring more foundations to this kind of political education attempt to become more radical, more political, and more systemic. Thank you, and sorry I've been too long and my English was awful.
Your English was fantastic, and thank you so much. There was so much packed in there, Nicola. And I don't think anybody minded that. Although you were timing yourself, we got some bonus minutes. And I'm really interested to hear about all that, and I'm sure we'll be questioning you carefully later. I'm now going to ask Ellie Besley-Gould, who is an expert fundraiser in all sorts of different types of fundraising, to tell us some of her experiences and advice.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start timing myself as well because I've got tendency to waffle. How to follow from Nicola? I think it's really interesting hearing the work that you do, Nicola, and also the work that Pete does on the funding side with his new hat on. Partly because it might feel quite logical to bring this level of partnership in because you've all been working so long in this area. But the reality is that what you're doing is actually quite brave and it's really bloody hard work. And although trusts and foundations on the whole say that they like collaboration, they don't like much innovation. And if they do, they just like a little bit of innovation, not too much. And the other thing that you're up against all the time is that when you're in a local government partnership, the implication is that local government ought really to be paying for it. So you're up against this sort of double fight just while you're trying to carve some space for yourselves. But what I am going to try and do very quickly is run through some sort of headlines on trusts and foundations very quickly, because Nicola has made that point so clearly, and then touch on some major donor and corporate thoughts, and then finish off with a quick run through crowdfunding, which isn't my forte, but then I'd asked a couple of questions about that. So
just before we get started,
yeah,
you don't have to be too quick, and in fact, if you could speak slightly less quick, it will help us all.
That's fine, I can definitely do that. So on trusts and foundations, I suppose, is probably the best place to start. Because what you're doing is genuinely quite innovative, I think the way to approach trusts and foundations who aren't already in this space is to be incredibly targeted. One of the things I would say is that it won't work going via a scattergun approach, just sending out some bump to 600 charity foundations, because that feels like the best way to get reach. In reality, you should probably treat them more like a major donor and look at specifically place-based trusts and foundations who've got an interest in your locality, because they will sort of understand the mission at hand. But the other thing is, you can really, really genuinely cultivate with trusts and foundations, because you don't want to waste their time and they don't want to waste their time. So I think finding out a bit more about them, getting to know them, meeting them before you send them any information. If they ask for information, this sounds so stupid and obvious, but answering their question rather than responding with your copy is something that seems to sort of hit quite well. And genuinely sort of getting to know what the funder wants and maybe playing a bit of a long game with them, because trusts and foundations, like anyone else, are accountable to the powers that be. And if we can find ways to make it a bit easier for them to say yes, then that makes their job easier too. The great thing about trusts and foundations, unlike many other people, is that they are set up to give their money away. So if you can find the right way to position yourselves to hit their targets, then that's great. Having said that, if you come across a funder and you think, oh, we're close to being relevant to them, or we're somewhere near to it, but we're not quite what they're after, just don't waste your time. Don't waste your time trying to get a square peg into a round hole, because you are so time and resource poor because you're trying to get your work done on minimal funding. And I just think go for your much lower hanging fruit, and they are quite restricted at this stage. So when I was first looking at municipalities in transition, it occurred to me that because of the nature of what you're doing and the prototype approach that you're taking, the real hits maybe are in major donor fundraising and corporate fundraising. I guess I lumped them together because they come with some benefits that both of those areas have. One is that they're perceived to be relatively easy to raise money through. Whether or not that's true is another matter. There's less hoop jumping, less form filling, less restrictions, less lengthy application processes, sometimes, than we find with some trusts and foundations. And I know that's not always the case. So Edge, for example, great example of how to do things in a relatively radical way and quite quickly. The other thing about major donors and corporates is that there's almost no information about them online. So they're actually quite hard to research, unlike trusts and foundations. So whilst they have their benefits, they also have their disbenefits. So if we're talking about major donors, I'd imagine these are people who could give in excess of about 10,000 GBP. Causes are everything with major donors. And perhaps the most important thing to think about is that these are people. So they have stresses and insecurities. They are used to being asked for money. But what we have to do is be able to understand what their motivations are and dedicate our efforts towards demonstrating why what we do can help achieve what their goals are. and not in a facetious way, just in a framing way. They tend on the whole, because of what they do, not always, to be really nice people. So you can afford to ask questions and get to know people and figure out what their motivations are. Once you understand what motivates people to give their money, you can feed on from there and generate a lot of questions and figure out what it is that could make them give to what you do. On the whole, there tend to be about 4 or 5 reasons why major donors give. Probably 4. They don't sound very friendly, but they boil down to human nature. The first of those is impact on the cause. You particularly see this in climate change. People, and actually things like the plight of refugees more recently, people genuinely want to make a difference to that cause. And so they are looking for ways to best make impact within an area that they're working in. The second is life experience. So I was once in prison, my daughter was an addict, I was rescued by an air ambulance. It's a payback to something which has made an impact on their life in a positive or a negative way, but which has a genuine touch point for them. So if you can get to know more about a person and figure out what it is that brings them to your cause, then you can maybe find out whether that works for them. Another is what we call insurance. So if I give to this cancer charity, perhaps my loved ones have a better chance of survival if they're faced with X condition. If one day I am poor, I hope there would be something like this for my children to survive through, etc. So there's a motivational cause around what if something happens. Another, which we see a lot more in North America, actually, I think, is around status. So my friends who are wealthy are giving. I ought to be giving. I need to find my charity. Or I'm a celebrity and I must do good things quite publicly. So if you can figure out what the motivation is around a person, that can help you with the conversation you have. It can take a really long time to motivate, to cultivate a major donor. And the best thing that we can do is look at the networks that we have around us. And that's one thing Transition has in spades, is the network. And figuring out who you know, who knows people. So if you can look at particularly place-based possible philanthropists, major donors, and then work backwards and see who in your network might be able to get to 5 or 6 people and just do a really targeted approach. Who do you know? Who do they know? Where do they go? Are they on a wealth watch? In some countries, you'd be able to figure out who's already a philanthropist, how much people are making. I mean, there's a lot of information you can find if you're able to put the research time in. And then I'd get a long list together, network check it against your list, and then shortlist and do some really targeted approaches and make sure that you're at the right places and you can invite them to things and so on and so forth. If you don't have a good network, and not all of us do, there are other ways of doing that. So we could, in some instances, set up a development board. And that would be a sort of advisory group who are well-connected people who may not have money themselves, but who are respected in your local area or in your context area, and who can access networks on your behalf once you've got that long list. So they can be really useful. You can get them together around the cause and in some way sort of extend the power that you have. So let me think if there's anything else on major donors. Oh, when it comes to asking for money, that's what I was going to say. I'm sure you're all well established in this area, so I won't talk to it for too long. But if it's relevant, take any beneficiaries you have. So anyone who's touched by the work that you do, whose life has been genuinely improved by what you're doing or what you're thinking about doing. Because if you can make the story really real and about a person, it's much easier for people to grab onto that tangible hold. Donors are used to being asked for money, so prepare them. If you're going to go in and ask for money, say that you're coming in for an ask. On the other hand, if it's the first time you're meeting them, do not ask them for money. Make sure that you've spent some time getting to know them first. Prepare a lot. What we do in my office is a sort of West Wing practice session. So we will sort of pretend to do the pitch and then have someone write down the absolute worst questions that you don't want to be asked and have the answers ready for that, which is quite useful, particularly in a situation where we have grassroots level systemic change and unpredictable outcomes. It's really good to be able to come back with responses which don't sound defensive or negative. And oh, that's my time up already. Jeez. I'll carry on. Very quickly though, if you bump into someone who you don't know and you think, oh my God, this person would be a perfect major donor for me, and I don't know them, I don't have time, the sort of cringy elevator pitch, instead of thinking of it as like my organization or my project in 1 minute, just say what you do, how you do, why you do, and then get their number. If you can just do the what, how, why, you can probably pin them in, rather than thinking about how to jazz it up and everything else. I'll get onto corporates. We can go on to any questions if or not, if I'm telling you exactly what you already know. Corporates. I don't know if it's the same for you and what you do, but I think I get told about once a week by our supporters and funders and board members that what we do would be perfect for a corporate funder. And of course, the reality is it's not as easy as that. So corporate funding seems to be coming into a bit more of an important role, since particularly the new economic climate means that both trusts and foundations and government funding seems to be decreasing. It's not a huge sector, and it's a sector which has very specific aims and objectives. And one of the things that you might find is that if you went for a CSR pot within a corporate, you'd get nowhere, but you might want to talk to their marketing team instead. Marketing teams tend to have a bit more financial budget to spend. And if you can demonstrate how you might be a useful marketing vehicle, then that's something to think about. I think particularly with the work you're doing, place-based corporates is an area you could work with. Again, I'd cultivate in a big way, because you just need to figure out who you need to speak to and what motivates them, and speak to different people at the company at different levels and figure out what it is that motivates the CEO and who else they're funding and what they use it for and who they're telling what they do. You can think about corporate giving in I guess 3 or 4 questions. One is, does it help build their business? So is it going to increase their bottom line? If in some way you can demonstrate how that works. Is it going to help build their people? So is there a way you can engage their staff to improve their staff experience in an HR way or in a quality of life way? Does it give them greater license to operate? So in your area, if they seem to be partnering with you, does that mean they can move into that space more legitimately? And then do you add brand value? So have you got an asset which demonstrates that it doesn't even really matter what it is they want to achieve, but does what you do match up with that? Because if you are fighting climate change and you want Shell to sponsor you, I mean, it might work. It's more likely that someone else would rather go for it. So there's a couple of pointers on corporates, but again, cultivate. Don't just fire off a deck to 600 corporates. Then very briefly, in response to Nenad's question around crowdfunding, if I was to give any advice on crowdfunding, it would be that whatever you do, it must be 3 things: urgent, solvable, and tangible. And when I say urgent, it really means now. You have to give today because, and you need to understand ways of how to frame the thing that you're doing to generate the urgency. And you can bring that down to, it has to be today because we have to get this project in, or it has to be today because otherwise we can't leverage this funding. It doesn't have to be today, otherwise climate change ends the world. It can be quite specific today. It has to be solvable. So climate change is sadly too big and too off-putting and too enormous for people to engage with. So if you can bring it down to a local, to a tangible level where people think, actually, I can switch the light bulb off, or whatever that small action is that feels like this is a solvable, genuinely solvable thing, then people are going to engage with it at a much higher rate than if you give them a huge problem that they can't even imagine how they'd make a dent on. And then the third is tangible. So it has to be something they can imagine, they can see, they can touch, they can sort of imagine in real life. So if you can apply those 3 rules, urgent, solvable, and tangible, then you're much more likely to generate a donation. Nenad, you were saying you needed 250 people to give monthly around €5 for your campaign. Just as a bit of background, the average monthly donation in the UK is £30, so you might be able to actually raise that target a little. because processing your €5 might cost you a bit too much. So I might suggest you go for a slightly lower number, higher target amount. But that's all, and I'll wrap up now because I'm well over my time. Please fire any questions.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Ellie. Again, packed with content. And I'm raising my eyebrows at these people who give £30 a month. Who are these people? Why don't I know them?
I was really shocked at that. But someone did say to me, actually, there's a really important rule about the, I can't remember what the terminology was, but it was the achievable middle. It's a bit like when you go to the restaurant, you get the second cheapest bottle of wine. You have to make your values when you're crowdfunding the right amount so that your middle number is the one that people go for.
This is fantastic. Well, I'm going to open this out. If you, we're going to ask you to put your hands up electronically. That means that the people we can't see can also put their hands up. So on the bottom row, there's something that calls participants, which again opens up a little window beside you, and it should be possible. You should be able to see a way that you can raise your hand. Is that, some people are nodding. If it's confusing, tell us in the chat or in some other way. So yes, if you would like to share your fundraising challenge or your question, or in fact your fundraising success, put your hand up now, and we'd like to hear from you. Has anyone got their hand up, or are you all very shy?
We have two hands. The first one is from Sarah, and
okay.
After that we have Nuno.
Okay. Sarah, then Nuno, then.
I had a question for, well, particularly for Nicola, although actually I had loads of questions for Nicola, so I'm just trying to think of what the one is. I was interested in, you were talking not only about what you were doing within your own foundation, but within Edge and you know, some work collectively. And I'm just interested in your experience of whether there are funders, foundations that are up for a co-design process around this sort of work, either individually or collectively. I'm interested in whether you've seen, I mean, within Transition Network, we've had a little bit of that experience of actually being able to co-design with our funders how a grant might work. I must admit to having a huge appetite to sort of co-designing with, you know, being part of a co-design process with a collective of funders about how, you know, how a collective program might work. But do you, I really recognise how difficult that is as well for funders. So do you think there is an appetite to do that? And what might make, you know, what might we do to make that more possible?
And just before you answer, I'm going to collect Nuno's question as well, and then you can answer both.
Hello, dear all. Thank you so much for this space. I don't have a question, but I wanted to bring a voice that maybe is familiar to most of us, but it's bringing also a bit of some wounds and some hard feelings to this conversation, because as someone who has been spending the last decade or so really trying to get away from mainstream and to really think where are the fundamentally shifting ideas, narratives, practices, things that can really help us to bring the world our hearts know is possible to life. I've been basically running away from funding, because funding has put me often in the last decade in a very familiar, hard space to be really innovative and creative. And when I was listening to Eleanor, I found myself feeling this familiar feelings of, we all know the drill, but the drill is very very consuming of energy, very life draining, because we know a lot of things. One of the things we know is that funders, especially major donors, they their worldviews are part of the problem, because we talk about narratives. And so I often face the feeling of, if I go to try to meet the narrative of someone who is benefiting highly from this current system, then I'm also putting myself in a life jacket in terms of what is possible to do to bring the change that we want to do. If I do that in my local reality, for instance, here in the south of Portugal, I find very few spaces where the kind of narrative I'm having is resonant to people, because people want recipes and they don't want to hear some things which are hard to hear if we talk about change. So the spaces where I'm kind of intervening to try to bring different ways to think about, well, first of all, different ways to even frame the questions around which we are exploring new possibilities, it's already very challenging. And none of these find support in terms of abundance and flow of resources and money anywhere. And I live next to one of the places where there's more healthy people coming to for vacations, which is Quinta do Lago, just a few kilometers away from where I live. But it's just like an inaccessible world, because if I go there, I'm going to do not be authentic, because I'll have to tell them something that is not true if I go on the narrative that you, Eleanor, were bringing. And I want to say that in contrast a bit to the story that Nicolas brought, because I think that part of what I feel more promising in the world of funding is this emerging places or spaces like the Full Circle Foundation or the Edge funders, where you have this idea that it's based on relationships and that you kind of test first. So there's prototyping, there's a space to start with a little seed funding, and you see how it evolves, and then you can see if it's possible to scale or not. But it's very hard for people who are bringing something that is really kind of challenging the status quo and really different, and we need somehow this dissonance, this divergent thinking to come into place. It's very hard to find a place to be funded and to experiment, because everybody wants results, wants big results, big numbers, and fat big quantifying ways to assess if their money was well spent. And we know that takes away, that kills creativity, that kills really a possibility to be disruptive. So I wanted to say that, because I think we need to together to think like what it looks like to look at funding in a space like this that is divergent, that is kind of disruptive, and that is not oriented on profit and other things that are kind of part of our mainstream funding structures, or on the other way, people who work socially for change but are in a place of really survival, extreme resilience, and that gets very far away also from where the possibility to have a nurturing life in bringing change is also allowed. So yeah, I just
thank you so much, Nuno. So Nicola, Ellie, and Peter, you have an amazing question and also an amazing challenge there to respond to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, it was very interesting and very challenging. So maybe back to Sarah's question. I think so. In my case, in my foundation's case, we give structural grants, which means that the grants are not connected or linked to a specific project. We give and we try to do it in a long-term perspective. So for examples, we've been funding anti-GMOs advocacy citizens campaign for 25 years. And the way we give the money is every year, and we pay, most of the time we pay salaries. So, but that doesn't mean that we don't co-design the grant, the agreement. Even if in the end we put in the agreement we just copy paste the global goal of the organization we support. But of course, behind and that's something that is not visible, we have a lot of discussions. And I know that it's also the case for colleagues in other foundations. If you just look at the agreement, it looks like, okay, you have to fit into the patterns, into the template of the grants, the grant making of this foundation. But in reality, there are many talks that led to this report and to the grant and to the agreement kind of contract. But it's taking time, and I think that doing this, having this process with several foundations, I can't even think of that. Even if that's what, in a way, that's what we're trying to prepare the ground for such thing to happen. But it's also a very long and very painful, very time-consuming process. For example, you will find on the Edge Funders website the statement, a kind of statement that we wrote to explain what we want to do with this Cities of Change Funders Collaborative. It's only 1 or 2 pages, but it took us 5 months. We were 6 different foundations, and you have to negotiate almost all the word, every single word. It's like in the UN discussions, but the results are very more humble. So that's a reality. But and also it's just maybe echoing what Nuno just said. We absolutely need this kind of political education within philanthropy. So that's what we are trying to do with Edge, building this political home. But what we need also to do is to engage with the mainstream funders. We shouldn't have this kind of, purist, left-wing mépris, how do you say, the despise, no? Or condemnation, no? We have to engage with them because they have the money, huh? And so we want them to use this money according to us in the best way, no? In a better way, at least. So that's also what we're trying to do. It's not easy, and sometimes you have to be very patient when you attend these very traditional conferences where you have only male on the stage and with suits and ties and all that. So you have to be very patient, you have to be articulate, and you have to be prepared to have this political discussion. And I think my last sentence is that even if they say they are not political, every single choice of a foundation is political. So you just have to make it clear what kind of politics you have, in mind and as an agenda.
I know Peter wants to leap in and say something before you go. Leap in yourself, Ellie.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Going straight to Nuno's point, really, about the degree to which people who want to see systemic change should engage with more mainstream people. I certainly know that at times I've got very frustrated by the kind of almost like games that I think Ellie was giving us really good, clear advice on how to do those things well. I've recently kind of changed my mind quite a lot on that front because of my sense of urgency. I mean, IPCC 1.5, okay, we're not going to hit 1.5. It's gone already, probably. But 2, we've got a couple of decades at tops. At tops, are we going to kind of ignore the extraordinary levels of funding potentially available to support more radical bottom-up movements, or are we going to try and do it? The question for me is not ever to say, oh, we're just not going to go there. It's then to say, how do we resource going there? So, if we are constructing bids to foundations like FPH, which have a much greater sense of the potential of bottom-up municipalism or whatever, do we build something into that which really reflect the time we need to do the work to actually start to build longer term relationships with more mainstream funders, for example. I've just been at a funders gathering in Barcelona, and one of the discussions I had with an apparently quite mainstream funder that did a lot of work around divest, invest, was they're acknowledging that that has remained a very mainstream thing and is not systemically challenging, but they're saying, you know, would I work with them on a next stage, which is how do we get more mainstream foundations to look at spending down in a time commensurate with the challenge of climate change? You know, so behind some of these apparently conventional front doors, I think there are more and more questions and doubts about what's going on in the world, and more uncertainty. So for me now is a time to focus on engaging. And as Ellie said, you've got to engage in a way that they feel that, particularly for staff members as opposed to board members, they feel that they can then take back into their organisation and not get immediately shot by the board members, basically. Kind of personal feelings.
Ellie, do respond. And while she's responding, if you have a question that's burning, then put your electronic hand up.
I mean, I've only got a small response, sadly. I wish I had a better answer, but we've sort of got two jobs, haven't we, in this sector, in this third sector, and one of them is to do our job, and the other one is to shift this juggernaut very slowly with the resource we have. I too struggle with where we get money from. I'm less ethically minded, sadly, but I'm sort of the mind that we have to bring in the mainstream in order to generate some shift, even if it's incremental at that level. And I think if we're working out how to do that, perhaps it's a case of figuring out what we are comfortable with and drawing a line, and figuring out who we absolutely would be unwilling to speak to about taking their money, because there really is a red line and then a sort of second line, and then taking no funding, of course, which is one approach. But it'd be sad to under-resource the incredible work just to make a point, I think. One of the other things that comes up time and again with funding conversations, which I think, again, we have a duty to fix, is the idea that when we're solving the world's most intractable problems, we ought to do it with an army of volunteers and no salaries. And that's something we have to take our funders on a journey of as well, because frankly, we're going to lose our best people if we don't pay them correctly. And you know, that you sort of made me think of that. And we've got a lot of challenges.
Everyone likes that point. Thanks, Ellie. Sorry if I interrupted you. Nanad, you have a question or a challenge or something?
No, I have a comment, not question. Actually, I would like to clarify something and also add to what Nuno was explaining. I don't think we do crowdfunding. We do something else. We call it community-supported bootstrapping. It's a kind of different animal, more in line with what we normally do. For example, in my circles here locally and internationally, there are difficulties in dealing with funders because they put too many constraints. And sometimes it's more practical just to pool resources among ourselves. And that's what we do. We are experimenting with that. It's not crowdfunding because we don't address crowds. We just, you know, talk to the community and pool resources together. Yeah. So it's a slightly different animals. Can I paste 2 links about this, maybe to share? Yeah, okay.
Please.
Thanks.
Do. Any other people with their hands up? Or I may ask a question of my own if you haven't. Let's see.
Go ahead, Nicola.
So, yeah, I mean, it might be interesting if our co-presenters wanted to comment on the subtle difference, in fact, of asking your community for support rather than crowdfunding in the traditional sense. But also, my question is, can you help us with ways that we can express our outcomes and impact when in fact our results are not predictable at the outset? So there's two things there, a question and a comment to reflect on, if anyone wants to go for it.
I've got a quick point on that. I don't think it's the answer. I think it's probably more of a question. But I think one of the things, particularly with large trusts, that we're asked to do is report at a level which would probably cost 10 times the price of the project that we're implementing. And the amount of information we're expected to collect it's laughable. I mean, it's absolutely impossible to think that we'd be able to do what we're supposed to do. And as a result, we either chuck some numbers in, or we give up, or we, can't be bothered. And one of the things we're starting to do in my work, and I don't know how relevant it is here, is look at some real outcomes which we can assess regardless of the output, if you like. So looking at how something has improved a person's quality of life, looking at a net promoter score, and maybe doing more qualitative research into where we see improvements in quality of life, why that happened, and what else, and just drill down a bit more so that we can collate a nice body of qualitative and some quant research that we can start talking to people about and building a story and painting a picture and getting a bit further on that line. Because I don't have an answer. What you do is groundbreaking, and as a result, it's difficult. The reality is we need a few angels to fund a lot of it, don't we?
Any other comments, Peter?
Yeah. I mean, in our case, I mean, I think we solved this question a long time ago, because when we started to fund systems change initiatives, or think tanks, or really trying to question the root causes of the crisis, and not only try to pass a new bill in the parliament or a new law. I mean, that will just tweaked or address some aspects of the crisis. So we agreed that it won't happen over the night. And so what we are looking at when we assess a partnership, we are looking at the strengths of the network that has been built and that has thrived or not, and you can put some figures. I mean, if your social basis has grew up or not, and at what kind of scale. The second one is the quality of the propositions, the proposals that you have framed, based on your network and the practices of your network. How do you shift from an addition of best practices to a coherent political vision, and how it would look like if it had to be a political program, for legislative elections or municipal elections. So that's also a way to measure the growth and the maturity of a movement. And the last one is the quality of the advocacy. What is your strategy? How do you engage with key decision makers? What are the campaigns or the discussions you had to promote your ideas? That's, in our case, that's how we look at the results of the partnerships.
Peter, do you want to come in on this one before I go back to Nanad? No. Nanad, go again. But actually, I also have a question for you, Nanad.
Yes.
Which is, in designing your bootstrapping campaign, where did you find out how to do that? Where did you get advice from?
Well, I guess the most interesting examples of this are here in Zagreb, in one of our transition initiatives. Bootstrapping is their main way of funding activities, and they are very active. So I was basically trying to transfer something that is, in-person community into something that is online community, which is not exactly the same thing, but we are trying to copy the practice. Yeah, and obviously the other inspiration was community supported. I don't know what's that and how it works. So it's basically consumers fund production. So in our virtual community of practice, practitioners the work needed. Yeah. So I wanted just to share an idea that might be useful in this context. It's nothing new or original, but it could be something that foundations could start looking into. It's called matching funding. So if there is an activity taking place in a community, foundations could match what is bootstrapped locally, and that's a technique that's been always used.
That is a good idea, and can I just encourage, particularly if you haven't yet spoken, if you'd like to contribute, put your hand up, give a comment or a question, tell us what you think. Anybody want to do that? Juan.
I can maybe just make a short question, while the others, the rest of participants, thinks in something else to ask or comment. Maybe, well, to all of you, but maybe Ellie is the one that can have a bit more information. But well, you have been, all of you, talking mainly about fundraising and working with foundations. But I don't know, could you maybe share some tips or ideas when we try to raise funding through European funding or other kind of grants, just to complement a little bit what we have been speaking? Even though maybe it's not, because this is another huge topic, but maybe you have a few ideas or something to share about that.
I think Peter's the man on that one.
I don't know so much about Europe, but I can talk about experience with government and with the big lottery here in the UK. And the big lottery, effectively, although it's meant to be independent from government, really is linked to government. So the first thing to say is that with all of these things, there's always an element of luck. The single best piece of funding that I managed to negotiate with the UK government, which with what used to be the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which doesn't exist anymore, that came about because I knew the right person when they had an underspend at the end of the year, and I knew that the Secretary of State was keen to make a political statement. So I put the two together and was able to arrange for a fund which would be controlled by the communities who were going to receive it, which had never been done before by a UK government department. And that's interesting from two respects. Firstly, it worked fantastically well, but that really came about because of relationships. And so you've got to be prepared to allocate the resource to spend time building those relationships. And then there's an element of luck. The second thing that was interesting was what the senior civil servants in that department then did, the administrators. They made sure that that never ever happens again, because they felt they'd lost control. So, there's a longer term issue then, which is what kind of public bodies do we want to have, and how much time do we put into influencing the direction of those public bodies? And at the moment, that seems to relate quite a lot to scale, where, in smaller countries in the UK, such as Wales or Scotland, it's much easier for change agents to build relationships with both the administrators and the ministers, because it's got a sense of community. You get to the scale of Whitehall, Westminster, England, then it becomes that much harder to do that. And so extrapolating up to the scale of the whole EU, I'm struggling I'm really struggling because, you know, you're also then up against the very well paid and funded lobbyists. So I know that Philippa has been trying to do these things in a different way, and that's one approach. I would say what we should be doing is trying to get them to look at the way they fund, the way they make their grants, as well as what the grants are for. And so that means really building on the existing relationships with existing special committees, etc., to say, please, can we start a dialogue about how the EU makes its funds available? Because under the current system, the sheer number of hoops you have to jump through makes it impossible for any small organization, particularly smaller organizations which are pursuing emergent outcomes rather than predefined outcomes. And given that we are talking about meaningful democracy, of course we can't predefine the outcomes.
Right. There's so much work to do, isn't there? And there's so little time. I can see Sarah's just put her hand up, but I was going to sneak a sneaky final question in myself as well. My sneaky question, I want to take you right back to when, Nicola, you said that funders have a fear that what they're funding isn't scalable. Because I feel like as a fundraiser, I often face this question: how is this going to scale up? Is it replicable? And I in a way, I sort of want to put it back. Is anything truly replicable, or is, in fact, it really hard to find a one solution that will fit all cases? So, yeah, I'm sort of interested to hear the honest feelings about, can we ever replicate and scale up? How is that? Does that really work? And then Sarah, please put your question or comment.
Should I go first, or?
Oh, well, let's just hear from Sarah, then you can answer both.
Oh, well, I was just going to follow on from what Peter was saying, to say that is also something that Ecoles is very much looking at, this question of how do we influence EU funding programs. You know, that's a huge question, and the sort of, as Nicola mentioned at the beginning, that was something that we looked at in this recent event in Brussels, the MIT event in Brussels that some of you were at. So you know, sort of two calls that Ecoles is pursuing at the moment. I mean, one area it's really focusing on is this call of the funding for processes and people rather than for projects, and really trying to find different people within the European Commission to have that conversation with. What might that look like, and how is that possible? And that's that's challenging, but there are conversations that happening about that. And then the other piece is that whole piece about how, because the European programs are at such scale that I think probably all the organisations that are represented on this call, you know, haven't got the capacity to manage the sort of money that they're wanting to deal with. So that another conversation with the EU about, you know, what is the scope? I mean, ask guests to do something similar to what Peter was saying of. Well, to create intermediaries who could then allocate resources in a more proportionate way, not to create intermediaries, to work with intermediaries, to work with partners who could then allocate resources in a more proportionate way that actually could be accessible to community groups. And sorry, the third bit of that, which I do think is interesting, is the whole bit about, I mean, the one part of the EU funding machine, and it does feel like a machine to me, it's very hard to build a relationship with that machinery, I think, with the human beings in that machinery. But the one part that feels a little bit more possible is community-led local development, and that's one of the areas that Ecoles is really sort of trying to nurture, because even community-led local development, which is available in a number of places, can still feel very bureaucratic. But that's where Ecoles is again trying to do something to soften the edges and make it a bit more accessible. That's me.
And Nicola, you were about to launch in. Let me not interrupt anymore.
Well, I don't have any answers to your question. No, I mean, well, we tried. I really try to think about it very seriously. I think I can find alternative. I think it's a question of jargon, maybe scale up. What does it really mean? So I have one colleague in OCIFE in Barcelona, Open Society Foundation in Barcelona. He talks about scaling across, which is a way to kind of avoid this trap of how, the replicability of a project or a campaign. It doesn't solve any problem either, but I think that's what I meant with this maybe prototype solution. I think a prototype is a kind of compromise between a place-based, very specific to a certain area, and something which is more relevant at the national level or even European or international. So a prototype is framed and designed to have, from the very beginning and from the ground, features that can be, used in other contexts. So I think that's the meaning of and maybe the added value of using prototypes. But you have to be very clear from the beginning that you want to have a kind of laboratory. Yeah? And I just wanted to add something in terms of maybe that's also something new for me. I was just talking about with Alternativa in France. This movement, they are very close and aligned with transition networks. And maybe at some stage, they would need funding for paying, recruiting a fundraiser. So maybe that could be a very smart investment, to add this money over the core support that some foundations already give to them to have the skills, helping them to do what Ellie just described, which is in a job. It's a real job in itself, and you need to have, skills and know-how, and maybe it's a stupid idea. I don't know.
I don't think it's a stupid idea at all. Lara, welcome from Brazil, and I'm really sorry because we're actually almost about to wind up. You will have to watch the recording. Ellie and Peter, do you have any last words you'd like to contribute?
I don't have anything else to say, but I wish you all luck with the incredible work that you're doing, and hope that it gets the recognition it ought to.
I think I would encourage everyone who's interested in this to find out what foundations are local to them, and just make sure you meet people from those foundations and talk to them and get to know them. And absolutely, as Ellie said, don't start out immediately with a pitch, but get to know them and build a relationship with them. Kind of, no matter how mainstream or not they are, assuming that they are there doing that job because they want to see change in the world. It may not be exactly the change you want to see, but they'll want to see some change in the world. At this meeting of foundations I've just been at, they were human rights funders. I didn't know many of the people before. Okay, there was a guy there who I nearly had to leave the room to avoid having a fight with him. But apart from that, there were people from pretty mainstream funders who surprised me with just how desperately they're searching for different responses to what's going on in the world. Lots and lots of funders are struck by the rate of change, the rate of negative change they're seeing, and the fact that the things they've been trying to do for the decades aren't leading to what they want to see in the world. So, if you can build a relationship, that opens up a discussion about what's happening in the world, and then what are the responses. It's kind of, that's all. yeah, good luck, everyone.
Well, I'd like to really thank our amazing co-presenters today for all their time and amazing insights, and thank you all for coming as well. And we discovered in the first webinar that in the chat box, if you click where it says more, there's an option where you can save the chat, because of course there are some links that have been put in that chat today which are really worth following and investigating. So that's something keeping up to. And yeah, time to take your mics off and say goodbye. Anything else you want to say? If you want to write anything in the chat to say what you're taking away, all this hope and all this challenge and all these excellent ideas, then please post in the chat. And yeah, look forward to seeing you at another of the webinars. That's what we should put in the chat, the link to the other webinars. Juan.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for this great facilitation. Thank you to all the presenters. And remember that this is the second webinar of the hot topics discussion. We will have 7 discussions till March. And next one is on facilitation next Monday. You have the information on the chat.
Excellent. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye bye. Au revoir à tous.
Au revoir.
Hasta bientôt, Nicola.
Hasta luego, Juan.
Hasta luego, hombre.
Hey.